Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Civics. Today, we're going to move away from the federal government and start talking about the two other major types of government in the United States, and that being the first one being state government. So that's what we'll talk about today. And then in our final episode for now, our next episode, we'll talk a little bit about local government and what that looks like. Um, and then we'll be done for now. Of course, I do have other ideas and whatnot, but for the meantime, this will be the amount of civics that we'll be doing. Um, More may become in the future, but until then, this is going to be it. So enjoy it while it lasts. We've got a little bit more government knowledge to learn about. So, like I said, today we're going to talk about state governments. And in our Constitution, it says that each state must have a Republican form of government. Now, what that form of government takes is up to each state, but it has to be Republican in form. That's written in the Constitution. So there's a kind of a general outline of what that means, but for each state, it differs a little bit, right? Um, so like I said, right, each state government might differ from state to state, but there are some generalities that each state has. For one, each state has a governor, and that governor is the executive leadership of the state government. So if you think about how the federal government has a president and the vice president and that bureaucracy, each state has a governor, and the governor performs that kind of same role for the state. They're in charge of the state's bureaucracy. They appoint certain people. They are the ones who sign legislation into law. Same kind of responsibilities the president has. There's also always an assembly of some sort. Now, the assembly can take many different forms. For instance, right, they're not actually that many different forms. There's usually actually only like two forms. Um, there's a bicameral legislature, much like the federal one, that has two houses. 49 of the 50 states have a bicameral legislature. They don't call them Congress or the House of Representatives or the Senate. They usually call them something else. So like they'll call it the Assembly and something else, or they have different names for it, but there'll be two houses. And then in one state, which is Nebraska, they have only one house. So there's only one legislature in Nebraska. So that's the odd one out, the oddball state in that sense. And then, of course, each state has its own court systems that, just like at the federal level, they are the ones who sentence people for crimes or solve civil disputes. Same kind of deal. And then finally, each state, of course, has their own state agencies that they control. So, for instance, I live in Wisconsin. The Wisconsin has a very active DNR, so a Department of Natural Resources. They've got a DMV. They have election offices. They have all sorts of different things. Same thing also grew up in Illinois. In Illinois, they have the same kind of stuff. They have a DMV. They have all that kind of thing, right? So there's all those different kind of organizations exist within the executive part of the state government. So, like the national government, the federal government, all the state governments are similar in that sense. They have the same general structure, right? That Republican form of government I was talking about. And, they might be called different things, or they might have different positions or different names for stuff, but they're all generally the same. And they have the same general functions. And then, of course, what do these state governments do? Well, the state governments get certain rights that were not reserved to the federal government in the Constitution. Remember, Amendment 10 says that any right that's not explicitly listed in the Constitution is given to the states to determine. So the state governments actually have power over a lot of things that the executive branch or the federal government can't really do anything about. So, for instance, state governments generally are in control of things like education, things like vehicles, things like the Department of Natural Resources. They get to do that kind of stuff, like hunting licenses and as well. Something that's been really controversial before 2016 or 2004, whenever the marriage law was passed, 2014, yeah, 2015, in that era, right? Was each state got to decide whether or not who could get married or not, right? That was something that was, the federal government has no control over that necessarily, and so the states got to set that individually until that Supreme Court case changed that. So, so those state governments have control over these more minute, day-to-day sort of things that the federal government doesn't have any say in necessarily. And so that means that the state has a kind of a much bigger influence on your day-to-day life than the federal government does. Now, things the federal government does can affect you on a day-to-day level, but there's a higher chance that whatever the state government is doing is going to have a higher effect on what you're able to do, allowed to do, and whatnot. One other major thing to do with states and their state governments is that state laws are supposed to be underneath federal law, right? Federal law is supreme over state law. We learned about that when we talked about the Constitution. However, it's becoming increasingly different in that sense. And here's what I mean. So, for instance, state laws could become what would be more stringent than a federal law is. So, let's say if we wanted to talk about one of our Supreme Court cases that we were talking about earlier, Roe versus Wade, right? It said that abortion must be legal up to a certain point for everyone. Well, state laws have been increasingly trying to restrict that, so it's still legal, but in a way that makes it almost inaccessible. So, for instance, in the South, there have been a lot of abortion laws that have talked about um, once you can hear the heartbeat of the fetus, abortion cannot be done anymore, and that's more stringent than the law set out by the Roe versus Wade and in the federal law. So that's an example where state law might differ from federal law. It's still within the realm of what the federal law says, but they're trying to be more restrictive. So that's something that can possibly happen. The other thing is where state laws completely counteract federal law. And that's happened multiple times throughout history. And oftentimes the federal government will be like, no, you can't do that and stop it. But there have been instances where they have not. So one instance where they have not is with marijuana legalization. Currently, there's 20, 30-ish states that have legalized marijuana, either for medical use or recreational use, or just varying degrees of legalization of marijuana. Um, and all of those laws fly in the face of federal drug laws that say that marijuana is illegal in the United States. But the federal government has decided whether or not they're going to enforce those laws or not. So under the Obama administration, they did not enforce those laws. So if the state said, "Hey, we're not going to do that anymore. We're legalizing marijuana," federal drug enforcement agencies were not supposed to mess with that. Um, whereas under the Trump administration, their direction has changed. So now they're trying to enforce it. I'm not exactly sure. Nothing they do is particularly clear, but their stance is different, obviously, right? So from administration to administration, those differences are being enforced in different ways. Anyways, that's basically all I've got to say about state government. It's a pretty generalized thing, but unfortunately, right, there's 50 different states, and it would take me a lot of time to go through each individual state on its own. So instead, I generalized, and in your own civics class, you will learn about your own state government. They will teach you about how it works. You probably will even take a field trip to the Capitol or something like that at some point. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. Stay tuned for the last episode of Civics for now. Coming up next. See you later. Bye.